Ah, the GameCube. It was a very interesting console and important to a lot of people. I mean, you can probably name several big YouTubers whose main exposure to video games was the GameCube. For me personally, I like it, though it also frustrates me. It's commonly considered good, which I agree with. It has some amazing games on it, and yet it was a commercial failure for Nintendo, only beaten in that failing by the Wii U and Virtual Boy. So, it's time to go over almost everything GameCube. Let's first go over the console's life, and then analyze its library. So, how did the GameCube come to be? Let's go back a generation to when 3D was getting popular. 1992 brought us some polygonal pioneers like Alone in the Dark and Virtua Racing, along with some raycast games like Wolfenstein 3D, but 1993 would be when 3D really kicked into gear. Ridge Racer, Virtua Fighter, Doom, even Star Fox, all of them made people enthusiastic about 3D. And while PC hardware was getting there with 1994 games like The Elder Scrolls Arena, Earthsiege, Magic Carpet, Descent, and Geograph Seal, consoles were only starting to enter the world of 3D. The 3DO came first, and it was sort of dead on arrival. It was a good attempt with some solid specs for the time, but it was just too expensive to be worth it and lacked quality titles. The Jaguar was so shit I have multiple videos on it, and the 32X was so bad it killed Saturn. So, let's focus on the approach that the Big Three took. The Saturn started its development all the way back in 1992, while the PS1 and Nintendo 64 started their development in 1993. The Saturn's approach to 3D was a bit of a handful, though it's understandable why SEGA did what they did, and though their approach did cause some issues for developers, it didn't do anything to compromise their visions. The PS1 was very simple and straightforward, while the Nintendo 64 was... Okay, so here's the thing. The NES was pretty uncontested within the US and Japan, so Nintendo managed to kinda be the default option for many third-party developers. As competition was heating up with the Mega Drive, Nintendo managed to hold on to third-party developers along with their backlogs. That's why the SNES has so many cool games. And then, most developers moved onto the PlayStation instead of the Nintendo 64. But why was that? Well, for one, the licensing costs on Sony systems were just far cheaper, and the cartridges in the Nintendo 64 were far more expensive to make, so you had lower profit margins, and they stored a lot less space, and while they were faster, many key players like Square and Enix would just leave Nintendo for Sony, as they just had the far superior option for the time. Couple that with a console that was difficult to wrangle with a lot of the time due to some questionable hardware choices, and Nintendo was struggling. So, they planned to make a new system, a better system, and finally beat back PlayStation and take the crown back. SEGA already launched theirs and it sold a bit until the PS2 killed it, but the PS2 didn't really have that big of a library early on, so maybe there was a chance. Looking at the console market in a vacuum, here's how it seemed at the time. Sony saw the Saturn's complexity and said, "Hold my beer," replacing the Saturn's 8 processors with the PS2's 10. The Dreamcast was not only a little bit too weak, but also discontinued before the GameCube and Xbox even released. And I mean, the Xbox itself is basically just a PC. So what was Nintendo cooking? To have a successful console, you first must have a functional one. So let's go into the hardware really quickly. Nintendo took note of almost every mistake they made with the Nintendo 64, and decided to fix all of them. That almost at the beginning is very important here. Project Dolphin was a joint venture between Nintendo, IBM, and Artex, which later got absorbed into ATI, a little over a year before the GameCube was released. IBM provided the CPU, the PowerPC Gecko, running at 486 MHz. The Gecko was pretty advanced for the time, and it was far faster than the PS2 CPU core, though the PS2 had its power stored in the CPU's vector units, which were more powerful than the Gecko. However, the PS2's GPU was basically just a rasterizer. Meanwhile, the GameCube's main flops were located in the far more conventional GPU, named the Flipper. While the CPU dissipated a whole 5 watts, the ATI Flipper dissipated a whole 45. It ran at 162 MHz and had a whole host of features that were lessons learned from the N64. It had 3 MB of internal 1TS RAM, which was extremely fast and super low latency. 2 MB of this RAM was used for the frame buffer and Z buffer, while a whole 1 MB was used as a texture cache. The frame buffer, Z buffer, and texture cache are the 3 most memory-intensive GPU operations, meaning they'd clog up the main bus if they weren't being done internally, inside of the GPU, on the extremely fast memory. The GPU itself had a bucket load of extremely modern features for the time. It was programmable, it also contained an audio engine inside of it, which was programmable, but Nintendo just gave you the code you would run on it, and the developers didn't really make their own codes for it, so it's kind of whatever. The design of the GameCube's architecture is sort of reminiscent of the Nintendo 64, however, it's far better designed. The CPU still accessed everything else via the GPU, the system still had unified memory, however, it actually had 24 MB of super fast 1TS RAM memory again, connected via a 64-bit bus. The RD-RAM on the Nintendo 64 used a 9-bit bus, just FYI. By the way, 1TS RAM is just DRAM enhanced to behave like SRAM, in case you weren't aware. The RAM itself was also twice as fast as the GPU at 324 MHz, ensuring there are no RAM bottlenecks. But the system also had audio RAM, or ARAM, 16 whole megabytes of it. Yeah, this one's a bit weird. So you had 16 megabytes of ARAM running at 81 MHz through an 8-bit bus again, but trust me, this kinda makes sense. It was meant to store audio for the audio engine, but you can still DMA to it to load and store data on it, and I don't know why they didn't just use a 32-bit bus or maybe doubled the RAM to 32 megabytes. It wouldn't have been that expensive, but the way developers did use the memory was with the Nintendo-provided library that lets them page stuff similarly to a page file on a PC, and this does result in a performance hit, but it just lets you use the ARAM for way more than audio, and a lot of the time it is worth it. Of course, the system had some ports, 4 controller ports and 2 memory card ports, everybody knows that. 2 serial ports, of course, one of them is reserved for the broadband adapter, the other one is unused, and also it had a parallel port that was connected directly to the ARAM, which was only used by the Game Boy player. Oh, and it also had analog AV out and also digital AV out in the early models. The controllers were solid. They lacked a shoulder button, the face buttons were weird, the C-stick was a nipple, the select button was still missing in action, but none of that is the main issue of the system. You already know what doomed them from the start.
This looks like a fucking chocolate chip cookie!
The mini-discs. They held 1.5 gigabytes of data, and a slower transfer rate than normal DVDs. Normal DVDs could have fit in the GameCube with some modding changes, so why did Nintendo do this? Well, there were 3 reasons. Number 1, Nintendo was concerned about piracy. That's the story you hear. And that is true, but also, the DVD licensing fees that you would need to pay. They paid a slight factor, but only with these 2 factors, Nintendo could have still gone with them. No, the 3rd factor, combined with the previous 2, is why Nintendo decided not to use them. They just didn't trust in the DVD format. They didn't believe it would succeed, so why support DVDs? Of course, that was stupid, very stupid in retrospect, and here's why. Of course, you can look at this from the aspect of, oh, but they went big. Even if DVDs sucked, here's why Nintendo should have still used them. Not only are you making sure that it takes nearly 3 mini DVDs to equal the size of a single full DVD, but DVDs were basically exploding in popularity when Nintendo was getting ready to unveil their design fault. They could have probably swapped to the normal DVD late in development after the PS2 was announced and had a good chance of succeeding, and something that's really interesting, at least to me, is the price of it. It was $199. It's often said that the reason the PS2 won was because at $299 it was the cheapest DVD player. But if the GameCube included full-size DVD playback, and let's say a 32-bit ARAM bus and 32 megabytes of the stuff just so you can inflate the price to $250, it could have been the cheaper DVD player. Some families bought their kids 2 PlayStation 2s because they had 2 kids and each one of them needed a DVD player, so 2 birds with 1 stone. 2 GameCubes of that caliber would have been $500 and would have probably had far more games on them if the developers didn't need to crush their games down to 1.5 gigs in order to run on them. So, mini DVDs doomed the GameCube. They gambled on DVDs sucking and lost the gamble, right? Wrong. They were just one of many factors. To find out the other ones, we need to look at Nintendo's game lineup and how they treated the third parties. The GameCube era is a really interesting one for Nintendo because a lot of beloved series like Metroid Prime, Luigi's Mansion, and Pikmin had their start here. This was the first time the West got to see games like Animal Crossing or Custom Robo. First time series like Famicom Wars were brought over to home systems with Battalion Wars. We had home Pokemon titles that had a proper storyline and gameplay. F-Zero GX is widely considered the best in the series and the last true F-Zero game. What is there not to love? Well, this was a weird period for Nintendo. I've left out 2 of their biggest franchises for a reason, and we'll get to them in a moment. However, first, shockingly, Nintendo published 2 of their own M-rated games during this generation, those 2 games being Eternal Darkness and Geist. Eternal Darkness is a great survival horror game, and Geist is a relatively okay received FPS about ghosts. Neither sold over 1 million copies. We'll get to why they were made later. Mario and Link were in a weird spot though, weren't they? Sunshine and Wind Waker were their most popular games, and I have some choice words about them both. Wind Waker was a bit criticized for its sailing aspect once people actually got to play it, but before that, people just complained about its graphics, which were very divisive, mainly because Nintendo showed off a gritty, realistic Zelda. And then the game was cartoony and cute. The Triforce quest is tedious, sure, but the game does definitely deserve the praise it gets. Though, I understand why graphics put at least some people off, even if they were wrong. Sunshine, on the other hand, had some elements that really didn't age the best, but here's the thing, it drops the ball in the way where it was so clearly rushed. Yeah, Bugshine is a funny game to watch people randomly die in, especially if those people are speedrunners. But bugs aside, what is there is frustrating. People claimed Mario Galaxy 2 was linear, but Sunshine is mechanically far more linear than any of the other Mario games. You only need 50 out of 120 shines to beat the game. You need to beat Shadow Mario in every stage in order to access the final level along with those 50 shines. There are 7 shines, and Shadow Mario is the 7th shine of each level, so that gives you 49 shines. But don't worry, before Mario goes to jail, he collects his first shine. That way, you can beeline for the 50 mandatory shines and just beat the game in any order you'd like, but they have to be the exact 50 shines. Flood is good in theory, but the fact Mario almost always has it makes it so levels need to compensate for it, and that leaves you with a ton of really poor design decisions, like running on tight platforms while flying enemies you can't hit push you off them. The entire game feels rushed. It only has 7 stages: the final level, the airship shine and the hub world, Delfino Plaza, so each level has 8 normal shines you linearly unlock, 2 secret shines that are in these weirdo random low effort levels, and a 100 coin shine. That and 30 blue coins. So you can expect to get 77 shines from beating the stages, 17 shines just in Delfino Plaza, 2 on the airstrip, and 24 blue coin shines, which would be fine if there weren't 240 blue coins, and that's always a chore to do. Also, you can often find one or both secret shines from just replaying the special floodless stages, because the second time you go in them, you can just choose to do the 8 red coin mission in the area that you already completed. The game isn't bad per se, but it's definitely rushed, and that also definitely hurt the GameCube's reception early on. Launch-wise, Luigi's Fuck Barn was a good game, but it just wasn't what people wanted. Nintendo wanted to show off the Nintendo difference, which meant doing things that other companies weren't willing to do. But there was also a reason that other games launched with games that appealed to more people, something Nintendo managed with Melee, but overall, they just struggled to get people interested. If Mario and Zelda weren't late to the party, I'd imagine the GameCube would have had a far better shot. But that's the thing, while the GameCube could have probably been ready earlier, Nintendo's launch games just weren't. They weren't ready for the 6th generation, and then they also pushed away third parties that would have drastically helped them. More on this later. Similarly, while Nintendo gained Retro Studio, the devs behind Metroid Prime and Donkey Kong Country Returns, they lost Rare to Microsoft. They were a very experienced and valuable dev team, so it's strange that Nintendo just let them get bought out like that. While Rare's Banjo-Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day wouldn't have been system sellers, a new Perfect Dark game would have fit in perfectly with the early 2000s edge, and even so, they were just really good developers. Speaking of edge, that matureness is also kinda what hurt the GameCube. It's a purple, sorry, indigo cube. That's not very mature. The PS2's boot-up sequence shows a digital cityscape. The Xbox's is just an alien reactor, while the GameCube's is a toy. While we laugh at it now, this was the generation of edgy games like GTA, Half-Life, and Halo. And launching, Nintendo had Luigi and Pikmin. Geist was sort of a reaction to this edge. I'd argue a lot of the early titles sort of harmed the console's reputation. Even though Wind Waker was a good game, it came out at a really bad time to be Wind Waker, and all of this combined made Nintendo's GameCube seem like a kiddie console at a time when most people didn't want a kiddie console because they wanted to seem cool, and of course that includes a lot of the kids who didn't want to seem like kids. Not having DVD playback capabilities really didn't help Nintendo's situation either, but Nintendo & Co. isn't the only company that makes games. Yeah, so the GameCube had really bad third-party support. Basically, Nintendo was a far smaller platform with a worse media format, so developers would struggle to port their games over to GameCube. Nintendo decided that the best strategy was just to wait for developers to come to them first, before realizing that was a bad idea far too late. They still managed to get Capcom to make RE4 a temporary exclusive, also port RE2 and RE3 and remake RE1, and we got RE0 and Code Veronica X. It's kind of insane just how many RE games there were on GameCube. There's 6 of them. And it's honestly surprising just how many interesting and fun games we got on the GameCube. So let's go through them. Now, I know some of you don't care for like Tarzan Untamed, NFL QB Club 2002, or Aggressive Inline, so I'll be focusing on some of the more interesting games. If you wanted Big Mother Truckers to truck me harder on here, I'm sorry, so let's begin in order of release. 2001. Luigi's Mansion. What is there to say? Often argued to be a glorified tech demo, while this game falls flat in a few aspects its sequels would definitely improve upon, like catching ghosts could have had more work put into it. I far prefer how it's done in the modern games. It's still a lot of fun to play, it looks nice, and even though it's a launch title, it's just fun. It's a great ghost hunting adventure, excluding the Colossus ghost, that one sucked. Super Monkey Ball. You turn the stage around the monkey to move him, like in those arcade games where you guide a ball. It's pretty fun, though the tasks make my head spin. Pikmin, the Miyamoto's new franchise. It was a cute little action strategy RTS game where you just explored a planet with these little Pikmin guys you controlled. You went about and used them as movies like to portray the Soviets used the Red Army during World War II, you know, throwing them at objects and enemies till they die. Each color had their fancy abilities, you need to perform various objectives, and the game also has time of day, which you need to keep track of. You don't want to stay out at night, that's when Herobrine comes out. Overall, it's really fun, but StarCraft is the better RTS. Super Smash Bros. Melee. What is there to say that hasn't already been said? It's a fighting game that's released a bit buggy, but those bugs are why so many people love it. People get very sweaty over this game, and its mere presence also causes pieces of soap to simply vanish. Overall, people like it. I've never cared for the Smash Bros. Series myself though, at all. Dobutsu no Mori, also known as Animal Crossing, was first unleashed upon the West on the GameCube. I get why people like it. It's one of those games where you don't need to explain that much about. You just kinda go around and do tasks, but it's mostly interesting that the English localization was so good that it was relocalized as the special edition in Japan. 2002. Resident Evil, often just called a remake, was a full-on remake of RE1, designed like RE1 would have been if it was made on a system that could handle the full developer vision, along with all of the decisions and changes that game devs learned during the making of those previous RE games. It's great. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem is a Nintendo survival horror game, and unlike Geist, it's really fucking good. It tries to mess with your head. It's definitely something that is really scary in 2002, but maybe not so much today. It was also made by the guys who previously made Legacy of Kain Blood Omen on the PS1, and it is really nice that they made a cool game. Just kind of a shame they never made another one. Super Mario Sunshine I already talked about, so you can go back in the video backwards to learn more. Phantasy Star Online was one of the first properly online games, and here on the GameCube. I'm just including all of their games here because they all have offline modes, so even if they're meant to be played online, you can still play them offline, and they even have fan servers that you can play on today if you're into that. Star Fox Adventures is not a rail shooter, but a different game with Star Fox characters put in. It's an action-adventure game. It was developed as Dinosaur Planet. It was a decent game, though some fans were annoyed with the different game mechanics, but if you don't like the Star Fox gameplay loop, it may be to you. In a way, it was the saga to Panzer Dragoon, and while I'm the type to appreciate games branching out and having different types of games set in the worlds of their more arcadey counterparts, some aren't. Those people hate this game and spin-offs in general, and that's kinda dumb. Mario Party 4 was the fourth Mario Party game. That's about it. Resident Evil 0 was a prequel to Resident Evil. It started development as a Nintendo 64 game, but later switched to GameCube. It's styled similarly to Remake, though it's also really good. Metroid Prime. We found it. Took them around a year after the GameCube came out, and they already made the best thing on the system. Yeah, RE4 exists, and Leon sure is hard, but goddamn, everything about Metroid Prime feels just right. It's the Panzer Dragoon Saga of the GameCube. I should probably start comparing games to Panzer Dragoon Saga. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time / Master Quest. was a port of the Nintendo 64 game and its Japanese Ura Zelda expansion to the GameCube, included as a pack-in with our next game's special edition, Frogger Beyond. It's Wind Waker, and I already talked about this game. It's mid-waker compared to Twilight Princess, but it's still a good game. 2003. RE2 and RE3 were just ports, but I guess they deserve a mention at least. Mega Man Network Transmission was a fusion of the Battle Network moves with the traditional Mega Man formula. It wasn't reviewed the best, but it's alright. Piglet's Big Game, no, wait, who keeps writing these? No, Piano 3 was a very futuristic-ish third-person shooter. You control a woman who may as well be a poster child for the Y2K techno stuff we associate with this era and an extra in the Perfume music videos. But you get the gist. Lost Kingdom 2 is a FromSoft card action role-playing game. It's an action RPG. No, it's not Dark Souls, it's fine. Wario World is a game I really liked until a specific segment that pissed me off to no end. Excluding that, it's a fun game where Wario can perform wrestling moves to fucked up looking bosses and enemies, and it's all a bit of an acid trip. I don't know what Treasure was smoking, but they sure were cooking. I want a second one of these though, maybe one that's a little less monotonous and a bit longer. F-Zero GX is, I'd argue, undeniably the best F-Zero game. It's fun to play, the music is great, I always choose Samurai Goro, it's just good, and extremely hard, but peak F-Zero. Resident Evil Code Veronica X was a port of Code Veronica. Universal acclaim, and more importantly, my acclaim. It's a good game. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was an ARPG. Gee, I'm sensing a pattern here. And it sure is a Final Fantasy game. It's good, it's sold well, you should play it. Tales of Symphonia was an action RPG. Yeah, that's a bit of a pattern, but it's basically... it's good on equal footing as the last game. It's pretty good. Tak and the Power... no, wait. Mario Kart Double Dash was the 4th Mario Kart entry. Of course it sold well. It's good, no shit. You can have 2 players. You can play both as Wario and Waluigi, but it is a bit slippery. Mario Party 5 was a Mario Party game. Pokemon Colosseum was a full-on Pokemon JRPG, released in full 3D glory. It's good and unique when compared to the handheld entries, especially of the time. Considering you could hold a GameCube in your hands via the handle, I don't know if this is a handheld entry or not, but it's really good. Gotcha Force is a third-person shooter fighting game. It's cool and you run around in tiny mechs. Button Kaitos Eternal Wings in the Lost Ocean is a JRPG where you control the protagonist via some kind of spirit who guides the protagonist via dialogue trees. It's a traditional RPG where you use magical cards, Magnus Flare items, weapons, healing armors and such. They're the item system used for everything you'd want to use items for. Also, like, a Magnus containing milk will turn into cheese and such, so things can spoil. Mechanic that I'm personally neutral on, because if you play it to its strengths, it can be a cool bonus. Plot-wise, I'm not revealing anything, go play it. 2004. Custom Robo is an RPG. You have the real world, but you fight enemies in a virtual robot arena. You can customize your robots, hence the name, and the game's progression is actually story-based, with an actual plot and such, which I'm again not spoiling. Metal Gear Solid: The Twink Snakes was a remake of Metal Gear Solid, but also redesigned so it fits more in line with Metal Gear Solid 2. It's good, though. Some people prefer the PS1 version. Both are pretty different though, you should try both. The Legend of Zelda 4 Souls Adventures is a Zelda game where you control 4 Links. It's fun, and you can use some interesting mechanics, and it works both in single player and multiplayer. While this game can use GBA connectivity, it's often just far more convenient to not use it at all, cause looking up and down all the time is just annoying. Pikmin 2 was the second Pikmin game. A decent chunk of things stay the same, but instead of having one commander, you have 2. There are also new Pikmin types and other objectives, and there are also randomly generated caves that don't progress time while you're inside of them. Fun. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door is one of, if not the most beloved Mario RPG. I've played the Switch remake on the channel, but this game is just wonderful in so many ways. It's a fun Mario RPG. My only complaint is that some of the bad guys get a really shitty half redemption in the end credit scene. Like, the guy who tried to steal your fucking skin and kill you has a role in acting. Why not kill him off? Past that, the game is great. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is the second Prime game. While I'd argue it's not as good as Prime 1 for a couple reasons, like the difficulty being a bit weird and the light and dark mechanics being a bit annoying, it's still a great game. Mario Party 6 is a Mario Party game. 2005. Resident Evil 4 was a new type of Resident Evil game. It's far more action-focused. You're playing as Leon, who looks far better in the remake, but anyways, you suplex zombies and shoot them. It's RE4. It's good, it's fun, it's great. Star Fox Assault is a Star Fox game. You fly R-Wings, drive tanks, or do stuff on foot. Some levels are on rails, some aren't. The game is fine. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is a tactical RPG. It's Fire Emblem, you either like it or you cringe. Chibi Robo was a game where you controlled a tiny robot and explored a house while helping the family that owns you. It's okay. Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness is a full-on Pokemon adventure again. It reused some of Colosseum's assets, and it's actually a sequel to Colosseum, and more importantly, a fun game. Geist was the funny weirdo FPS game with ghosts that let you control other creatures. It's weird. You get to possess things and do strange shit. It's not a bad game, but it's very weird. Battalion Wars was an RTS based off of Famicom Wars, or Advance Wars in the West. It's really fun. You get to control a soldier while commanding an entire army. It's like a third-person shooter, plus an RTS, though stuff like aiming has been simplified so that switching troops and doing that other stuff is a bit easier. Mario Party 7 is a Mario Party game. 2006. Odama was made by the same guys who made Seaman. It's pinball, but you kill people for big ball. Baten Kaido's Origins is a prequel to Baten Kaido's. The mechanics are mostly the same. It's like it's a prequel. Twilight Princess was the Zelda game that people wanted. Looked good, played good, and, well, sadly, the latest ports of the game are on Wii U. At least the game lets you play them with a Pro Controller so you don't have to look at the awful tablet. Same goes with Wind Waker, actually. Play it. And that's it. While there were some solid titles of ports I didn't mention for the sake of brevity, the majority of the ports seem to be either sports games or children's movie tie-in games, and the ones that weren't were often just multi-platform titles anyways. And that's the thing, if you go back through my list, you'll see just how many of the notable GameCube titles were made by Nintendo. The fact the GameCube was seen as a kiddie console meant that a ton of kiddie games were made for it, which only made it seem like more of a kiddie console, and this feedback loop resulted in the console having the reputation that it did. And because of that, if you bought the GameCube, you would be limited to the first-party Nintendo offerings, maybe a few third-party games, and an ocean of ports that are also on PS2, which is exactly why most people just bought a PS2. As you had those multiplats, you had DVD playback, and an ocean of high-quality exclusives. But let's take a deeper look. Mario and Zelda were more of the same. Or were they? Well, they sort of were. Either way, you definitely weren't starved of those games. But the console started off with Luigi's Mansion and Pikmin, two completely new series people were unfamiliar with. Smash Bros was of course Smash Bros, which people knew of, but a ton of the exclusives on the GameCube were just unknown. As good as most of them were, they just lacked the mass appeal and familiarity early on. Star Fox? Yeah, we had Star Fox Adventures, Metroid Prime was amazing, but a ton of people didn't know it because it was in 3D and they were stubborn. From the other games, Pokemon Colosseum and Custom Robo were really cool, and Pokemon Colosseum did sell a lot of units, but again, they just came in a bit too late and didn't have the same kind of mass home console appeal. The system still had quite a few good games that were mainstream, but most of them didn't even come out in time, while the PS2 launch titles also weren't that good. Holy shit, did the system blow up in 2001. If we just take the 10 games out of the already huge library that the system amassed by then on, we'd get, oh I don't know, Ace Combat 4, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, Gran Turismo 3, GTA 3, Ico, Jak and Daxter, Metal Gear Solid 2, and Silent Hill 2. Yeah, let's go with the 2001 holiday release. And that's not counting all the other really cool games that came out by then. Comparing just these 10 to the 2001 GameCube lineup, it makes sense why Luigi's Mansion and Wave Race couldn't do anything to stop the already gargantuan amount of PS2 bestsellers that were already out. In a way, the system released too late and too early. Too late to compete with the PS2 before it got the aforementioned ocean of games, and too early to have its own heavy hitters ready for launch. While Nintendo did try to tap into markets like FPS or survival horror, they struggled to get JRPGs and other big games and big names onto the GameCube, partially due to the small disk space and child user base. By the end of this generation, the GameCube was trailing in last place. The Dreamcast would have been last, but it fell out of the race before the generation even properly started. I don't even really consider it a 6th gen console for that reason, but let's include it anyways in this comparison. The Dreamcast sold 9.1 million units, the GameCube sold 21.7, the Xbox sold 24 million units, finally the PS2 sold 155 million units. It was a complete sweep. Games-wise, it's actually more interesting. So the best-selling GameCube games were Super Smash Bros. Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Super Mario Sunshine at 7.41, 6.88, and 5.91 million units. In comparison, the best-selling Dreamcast games were Sonic Adventure, Shenmue, and Resident Evil Code Veronica at 2.5, 1.2, and 1.14 million sales. On the Xbox, Halo, Halo 2, and Fable sold 8.46, 5, and 3 million units. On the PS2, San Andreas, Gran Turismo 3 and 4 sold 17.33, 14.89, and 11.76 million units. Interestingly enough, the GameCube's library is again a lot more top-heavy than the other systems. 36 GameCube games sold over 1 million units, while only 22 million Xbox games were so fortunate, and 7 Dreamcast games. On the PS2, while a staggering 165 games sold more than 1 million units, far more of them were sports games than on any of the other systems. Also, while the PS2 sold 6.64 times more games than the GameCube did, 1,838 versus 208 million, it actually sold 7.1 times more consoles than the GameCube did, which means the roles were reversed from the last generation. The average GameCube owner had 9 to 10 games, while the average PlayStation owner had around 9. Not a huge gap, but an interesting one nonetheless, probably caused by the PS2 being such a cheap DVD player. Finally, the GameCube reached its peak sales in 2003. By 2005, the sales were dropping off, and by 2007, they were down on the shitter. Most of those sales were actually in the US, 12.55 million of them, compared to the 4.44 million sales in Europe, 4.04 million sales in Japan, and 0.71 million sales elsewhere. The PS2, for contrast, outsold the GameCube's total sales in 2002 and also reached its peak in 2003. Its sales began to decline past that, but far more gradually. It still sold more units in 2010 than the GameCube did during its best year. The PS2 sales were also far more uniform, with 43 million in the US, 32 million in units, and it also did immensely well in Japan with a staggering 21 million units there, which is insane considering Japan's population is far smaller than the other regions. And the other 59 million was sold in the rest of the world. It was truly a global console. So, there are the numbers, so maybe we can finally figure out what actually killed the GameCube. The lack of DVD support, sure, compared with Nintendo's poor choice of launch titles, but then also, the lack of care for their partners and third parties in general, along with them really not changing with the times until it was far too late. That last one is very appropriate for even modern Nintendo, though sometimes that is for the better, like them not wanting to use AI. So how do we fix the purple cube? Well, you really don't have to do much, just add a full-size DVD drive, and to make me happy, double the RAM and give it a 32-bit bus, you know, plus make it so the CPU can access it directly without DMA, because, again, makes me happy. And I'd also personally make the controller more contemporary with the other ones, because it was lacking a few buttons. Past that, Nintendo should have bought Rareware along with Retro, and they should have focused on bringing in third-party developers far more and also rearranging how they worked on games. Instead of working on Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, and Wave Race, focus on getting Sunshine and Wind Waker out the door first. Animal Crossing was a port while the other early games were being worked on by other developers anyways, or they were too important like Melee. If all of that was done, Nintendo would have had a better relationship with third parties, their hard hitters would have been sort of ready for the console's launch, and it would have also been the cheaper DVD player. Would it have beaten the PS2? I don't know, my crystal ball's broken, but I'd bet it'd perform a lot better than the Xbox, possibly keeping the discussion of gaming as a fight between Nintendo and Sony, and not Sony and Microsoft. But then we can look into the future and find a slight issue, a very Wii-shaped issue. You see, the Wii DS and all subsequent systems were built upon the idea of the Blue Ocean strategy. Basically, instead of competing with Nintendo and Microsoft, Nintendo decided it would be a better idea to find new, untapped markets, like casual gamers with the Wii and DS. If the GameCube did a lot better than it did in the real world, it would be interesting to ponder what type of world that would create. Would Nintendo ever want to step into the world of casual gaming? Would Nintendo's next system be competing with the PS3 directly in CPU and GPU power? The 360 is in some ways kinda similar to what a true 7th gen Nintendo system would have looked like. But I think it's best to leave it off here, as predicting the future is the job of bad alternate history channels, not me. And that didn't happen anyways. We had a purple cube of 651 games, and a lot of those games ended up being really good. So which ones are they? Here's my top 20 personal GameCube games list. If you've made it this far, I'd like you to pause the video and write your own top 5, 10, 15, 20, or just a general list of GameCube games you'd like before you hear what I have to say, because I'm curious to what people enjoyed. To be clear, I'm not saying any of these games are good, I'm just saying I enjoyed my time playing them. Number 20, Shadow the Hedgehog. This isn't a good game, but it's hilarious to play. You know why if you played it, it's just funny. It's funny, unintentionally. Number 19, Mario Kart Double Dash. Not the best Mario Kart around, it's pretty slippery, but it's still one of the best I've played, and it's a lot of fun. Number 18, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Mid Waker as it's often called, it's still quite fun and looks quite nice. It's okay. Number 17, Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. I'm gonna stop, but it's Twilight Princess, it's the superior Zelda game on the system. Yeah. Number 16, Phantasy Star Online. It actually has an offline mode. as it's a multiplayer RPG and not an MMO. Community servers do exist, as I said before, so you can always play on those. It's cool, it's Phantasy Star. Number 15. Skies of Arcadia Legends. An enhanced port of the Dreamcast game where you're a sky pirate. A great game all around. Number 14. Resident Evil 2. It's a port of RE2 and it's good. Number 13. Resident Evil 3. A port of RE3. It's good. Number 12. Pokemon Colosseum. A fully 3D Pokemon RPG. I like how it's a little bit more serious than the average Pokemon romp, and it's fun to play and unique and has double battles. Number 11. Pokemon XD. Gale of Darkness. It's like Colosseum 2, also a lot of fun, and it's basically a refinement of Pokemon Colosseum. Number 10. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. This game brings the vibe of the original Metal Gear Solid on par with the rest of the series. Is it a replacement for the original? Of course not, but it's still a great game. Number 9. Wario World. I can beat the ever-loving fuck out of things in 3D as Wario. I love this game far more than most reviewers did, but that may be because I'm biased towards Wario. Number 8. Eternal Darkness. What if the guys behind Blood Omen made a survival horror game? Well, it's really fucking good. Better than RE? I'd say no, but it's definitely on par. Number 7. Resident Evil Code Veronica X. The first RE game to have a proper dynamic camera. It's good. Number 6. Resident Evil Remake, a remake of the first RE game. The game just looks amazing, though some of the delightfully atrocious voice acting has been fixed, so it's now just delightfully stilted. 5. Resident Evil 4. Still camp, but this time with a lot of action. It's more survival than horror, but goddamn is it good. 4. Battalion Wars. Let's take Advanced Wars and make them a fully 3D squad-controlled third-person shooter. It's a lot of fun, the cartoony visuals look nice, and I enjoy these kinds of RTS games. Number 3. Metroid Prime 2. A great Metroid game, absolutely. Continuing the story of Prime, it took what worked and tried to make it even better. It has some more frustrating sections, and I feel like the level design isn't quite as memorable though, so it has to be a little bit behind. Number 2. Metroid Prime. As I said before, the environment's a bit more varied than its sequel, and because of that, it's more memorable. It absolutely kept making me think wow whenever I entered a new area, especially the Phendrana Drifts. I have a Let's Play of this, you should watch it. Number 1. Luigi's Mansion. This is how I personally found out about the GameCube. Granted, that was a while after the Wii came out, but this was the first GameCube game I ever saw running. It's a great game in its own right, and seeing Let's Plays of it as a kid was what made me want to do YouTube. And I've played it more than once, and I've enjoyed it more than once. It's, in my opinion, a really good game. And it's partially first because of what it meant to me, but yeah. And there you have it. That's all I have to say. It's not quite everything GameCube. You could always dig deeper and find something more to talk about, as basically everywhere, there's more information. The purple box might not have been seen as the best during its life, but just like the Saturn, Dreamcast and other systems, it has seen a new life online, where now people can properly look back and enjoy and properly talk about some of the games which there wasn't really a community for back in the day. But yeah, now all we need is for Nintendo to make Battalion Wars 3. A Switch 2 launch title maybe? Please Nintendo, please?